Metabolism, one of the favorite throwaway terms for mainstream health media and fitness gurus to exploit for use. You'll hear terms like how to fix your metabolism and how to diet for your metabolism. Granted, most of these things are complete nonsense. However, one thing that has stood the test of time is the concept of metabolic adaptation. You may have heard other terms for it like metabolic damage, adaptive thermogenesis, or starvation mode. Remember when that was a thing? But even if you haven't heard of it, you probably have some sort of understanding as to what it is. It's the concept that the more that you diet and lose weight, the more difficult it becomes and the more your body fights you back. Anyone who tried losing weight for a prolonged period of time, say over 2 to 3 months, has experienced this to some degree. Now, there are several reasons as to why weight loss gets more difficult as time goes on. One reason is simply the fact that the less that a person weighs, the less energy is required to keep their body mass stable. This means that your metabolic rate, which is the correct term by the way, metabolism is a bit of a misnomer, is lowered, and that's meaning that you need to eat even less to keep weight loss moving. This is not, however, metabolic adaptation. This is simply the result of physics. Metabolic adaptation is the idea that as you diet down, your metabolic rate will drop even lower than what would be expected from the weight loss itself. For example, let's say that you diet for 3 to 4 months and you lose about 20 pounds. If you were to plug your new weight into an online calculator and compare your current result with the previous one on which you used your original weight, you might find that your total energy expenditure has gone down, let's say about 200 calories. Now, because you want to keep the rate of weight loss the same, you then go and subtract 200 calories from your current diet, expecting that this will cause you to keep losing weight at the same rate. What you might find, however, is that you're losing weight at a much slower pace, or maybe weight loss stops altogether, even though on paper you should be at the same energy deficit. That is a concept of metabolic adaptation. So first, let's get this out there. Is metabolic adaptation even real? Yes, of course it's real. It's been observed countless times, both in research and anecdotally. There's no debate as to whether or not it exists. The debate, however, is whether or not it's actually important enough to influence weight loss on a noticeable level. And that's exactly what we're going to discuss in this video. Now, first of all, let's see a little bit how the metabolic rate works, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty stuff. Your metabolic rate is the amount of energy that you need each day to maintain your current body mass, also called your TDEE, daily energy expenditure, etc. Now, there are several ways to break down metabolic rate into smaller compartments, but we'll be using the most common one. Your metabolic rate consists of 4 pillars. The first one is your basal metabolic rate, or BMR. This is the amount of energy that your body needs to keep itself alive and perform basic bodily functions. We're talking about breathing, metabolic processes, etc. This is basically the amount of energy that you would need if you were in a coma, doing absolutely nothing, just to keep your current body mass. The BMR usually accounts for 60 to 70% of your TDEE, although this can vary from person to person. The second compartment is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT. This is the amount of energy that you use each day to move around, talk, fidget, pretty much everything that does not consist of a deliberate effort to exercise. NEAT usually accounts for 15 to 20% of your TDEE. Next, we have exercise activity thermogenesis, or EAT. This is pretty self-explanatory. It is the amount of energy that you use for deliberate exercise, so going to the gym, running, swimming, dancing, you name it. Usually accounts for 15 to 30% of your TDEE. Now, many people actually combine NEAT and EAT together to form the total physical activity energy expenditure. But for the purposes of this video, we'll be treating them as separate, and you'll understand why a bit later on. And lastly, we have the fourth compartment, which is the thermic effect of food. This is the amount of energy that your body requires to break down food into basic nutrients. Now, when you eat food, obviously you get energy. However, your body does need to spend a little bit of energy first in order to get that large bursts of energy from food. Protein is actually the hardest macronutrient to break down, which is part of the reason why a high protein diet is so effective for weight loss. The thermic effect of food usually accounts for about 10% of your TDEE, but this can vary depending on the diet. Now, these average percentages are just that, averages. For example, athletes can have heavily skewed upwards percentages of exercise activity thermogenesis while having heavily skewed downwards percentages of everything else. If you're burning 1,000 calories from exercise alone, then it stands to reason that everything else will consist of a lower percentage. And these were the 4 components or pillars of metabolic rate. Now let's take a look at how metabolic adaptation might work, since it has to affect one or more of these pillars. First, I want to quickly mention what metabolic adaptation is not, so that we're all on the same page. It is not the natural decrease in metabolic rate caused by weight loss, as we have already discussed. It's also not the fluctuations of hormones like leptin and ghrelin. You see, your body will fight you back in a lot of ways when you're trying to lose more weight than what it wants. One of these ways is by increasing ghrelin, which is a major hormone responsible for hunger, and by decreasing leptin, which is a major hormone responsible for satiety. This means that on a chronic diet or weight loss, you'll be feeling more hungry and less full. Now, as important as fluctuations in these hormones are for weight loss, I don't consider them to be a part of metabolic adaptation. This is because they don't influence the metabolic rate directly. Instead, they influence you, the poor soap who's just trying to lose those last 10 pounds for summer. And what they do is that they urge you to eat more. And finally, metabolic adaptation is not the result of some sort of medical condition like hypothyroidism or insulin resistance. Those obviously affect your metabolic rate, but they are not the result of chronic weight loss. Now, let me be frank. No one has pinpointed exactly how metabolic adaptation works, and in all likelihood, it's a combination of a lot of different factors. That said, a major aspect of metabolic adaptation could be its effect on NEAT. Now, I mentioned before how NEAT consists of usually around 15 to 20% of your TDEE. But what you may be surprised to hear is that NEAT can actually get much higher than that. In some people, NEAT can actually reach up to 50% of the TDEE. Now granted, that high of a percentage usually means that the person is either not exercising, so has an overall lower TDEE, or that they perform a lot of physical activity that is not considered exercise. So maybe they have a job that requires a lot of walking. But 50% is still a huge number. Even on a lower TDEE, let's say about 1800 calories, 900 calories being burned from NEAT alone is a huge number. There is a ton of individual variability in NEAT. Some studies show that certain hyper-responders can experience huge increases in NEAT when being overfed. Unfortunately, the reverse also seems to be true. On a chronic weight loss, some people might experience rapid decreases in NEAT as their body tries to compensate for that reduce in energy intake. This is the general idea of how metabolic adaptation affects NEAT. The way it happens can range from something noticeable, like you walking and pacing around less in a room, from something completely unrecognizable, like you shaking less, for example, or not fidgeting as much. And again, unfortunately, when it comes to NEAT, it's luck of the draw. Some people will be affected more than others. And the people that tend to have high increases of NEAT when being overfed are usually the ones that are not influenced as much when being underfed. And the reverse also seems to be true. Now, this isn't 100% scientific fact, but it does fit into the whole notion of some people finding it much more difficult to remain skinny than others. Now, whether or not being unable to put on weight is worse or better than finding it very difficult to lose weight, that's up to you to decide. Now, aside from affecting NEAT, metabolic adaptation can also occur in the cellular level, affecting the metabolic rate directly. There are several possible mechanisms put forward by a study by Trexler et al. Called Metabolic Adaptation to Weight Loss, Implications for the Athlete. Link in the description. Some mechanisms might involve chronic dieting causing a decrease in certain thyroid hormones, causing a decrease in metabolic rate, changes in certain gene expressions, and other possible mechanisms that I'll spare you from in this video. But the gist of it is that metabolic adaptation could potentially cause a decrease in metabolic rate as a response to chronic weight loss and dieting. To what extent? Well, again, this will depend on individual responses as well as the degree and severity of weight loss experienced. A more aggressive weight loss will usually lead to a higher degree of metabolic adaptation, everything else being equal. Okay, so we saw how metabolic adaptation could potentially work, but the big question is this even important? Can metabolic adaptation actually legitimately impede our weight loss progress? There are some studies that examine the effect of weight loss and calorie restriction on the metabolic rate. There's a review study called Impact of Calorie Restriction on Energy Metabolism in Humans by Jasper Most and Leanne Marie Redman. In this review, they examined a lot of studies that have imposed a calorie restriction and pull the data together. So, as you can hopefully see on the table, they split the studies into three major types. The one where the participants were at a healthy body weight, the ones where the participants were either overweight or obese, and the ones where all participants studied were obese. And the final column here states the degree of metabolic adaptation. Again, this is how much the metabolic rate was lowered beyond what would be expected from the weight loss itself. This is not simply the drop in metabolic rate, it's the difference from what was expected. On the calorie study, if we focus on the groups that had undergone a 25% calorie restriction intervention, we can see that they experienced a metabolic adaptation of 8% in the first 3 months, and while they continued to drop their body mass during months 6 and 12, the metabolic adaptation actually stayed constant, if not decreasing a little bit, meaning that it didn't actually get worse as they were losing weight. On the other hand, in the 24-month time period, participants were not still losing weight, probably meaning that the weight loss had ended after month 12. However, metabolic adaptation still persisted, even though the weight itself didn't drop. This is probably because the 25% calorie restriction was not adjusted for the weight loss and metabolic adaptation, meaning that the participants were probably still in a weight loss diet, just not losing any actual weight. I focus more on the calorie studies because those are the ones that had metabolic adaptation as a primary outcome. In the Biggest Loser and Barrier studies, which studied weight loss in obese patients, we can see higher degrees of metabolic adaptation. The trend seems to be that the more weight lost and the smaller the time period, the higher degree of metabolic adaptation. For example, you can see that the weight loss of 49 kilograms occurred in only 6 months. That's about 108 pounds, which means that the participants lost, on average, about 8 kilograms or 18 pounds of weight per month, which is absolutely an extreme weight loss. The metabolic adaptation that occurred from this was a staggering 17%. That can be as high as 500 to 600 calories of metabolic adaptation, or maybe even more for some people. The researchers conclude that the biggest driving factor of the degree of metabolic adaptation was the direct restriction of calories. When the deficit was created with a combination of exercise, it seemed to lead to lower degrees of metabolic adaptation. I should also note that the calorie studies that examined participants in a tightly controlled environment measured metabolic adaptation by measuring RMR during sleep, or resting metabolic rate. This means that the NEAT aspect of metabolic adaptation was not studied on those particular studies. This review also mentions calorie studies that were done in free living conditions. The metabolic adaptation in those studies accounted for 13% in the first 3 months, 7% in the 6-month period, 6% at the 12-month period, and 9% at the 24-month period. This higher metabolic adaptation was probably due to the fact that NEAT was also calculated in these studies. Something else that absolutely has to be mentioned here, but will be covered in another video because it does deserve a video of its own, is the concept of the body set point theory. The body set point theory is the idea that each individual has their own body weight and fat percentage range that their body wants to stay at. Any attempts to push that boundary, either upwards or downwards, will result in the body fighting back, either by promoting higher metabolic rate and lower appetite if you're trying to push that boundary upwards, or doing the opposite if you're trying to lose more weight than what your body wants. The further one strays from that hypothetical range, the more the body fights back and the more difficult it becomes. Now, this is not an exact science, but there are clues everywhere that the body set point theory is actually legitimate. We know full well that many people find it extremely easy to stay skinny and find it very difficult to put on weight, while for other people it's the exact opposite. And it could very well be because of your body having some sort of thermostat, which tries to keep body weight stable and at acceptable levels by regulating all sorts of different conditions. Again, this deserves an entire video of its own, so stay tuned for that. Alright, so let's condense the information thus far to make it a little bit more digestible. Metabolic adaptation is real. The degree to which it happens can vary from, not a big deal, to, God, why do you hate me? The primary influences of metabolic adaptation are the severity of calorie restriction and weight loss, the time frame in which it happens, so pretty much how intense the rate of weight loss is, individual variabilities, as well as how far away one tries to stray from their ideal body weight. And now the million-dollar question. How do we prevent or even fix metabolic adaptation? Now, as with many problems in life, the best fix starts with prevention, or at the very least, mitigation. To minimize the degree of metabolic adaptation, you should 1. lose weight slowly. Look, if the fact that it's more sustainable, safer, favors lean mass retention, and won't make you want to kill yourself while you're doing it, are still not enough to convince you that slow weight loss is the way to go, then you should at least consider it because it does seem to reduce the effect of metabolic adaptation. 2. You should try and increase your deficit through exercise first. If you want to increase the rate of weight loss that you're experiencing, it is advantageous to try and do so by exercise first. So for example, if you want to cut an extra 200 calories, it's actually more beneficial to try and lose them from exercise first, and only resort to a direct calorie restriction if it's just not feasible for you to exercise more. And number 3, include refeeds or diet break periods during your weight loss journey. I absolutely love refeed periods, and I recommend them to pretty much everyone that's on a longer term weight loss journey. Diet breaks or refeed periods, whatever you want to call them, are phases in which you bump up your calories back to maintenance levels, usually for a few weeks, in order to give your body a bit of a break from the stress of constant weight loss. Now, obviously, the frequency of diet breaks will depend on a lot of factors, including how fast you're losing weight, how much weight you actually have to lose, and several other things like individual response. But I usually recommend 2 or 3 weeks of diet break for every 2 months of consistent weight loss. Now, if you're already suffering from a high degree of metabolic adaptation, then the only real practical way to reverse that is to bump up your calories for an extended period of time until your body readapts to a higher calorie intake. Now, ideally, you'd be keeping close track of both your caloric intake as well as your weight fluctuations throughout your weight loss journey. By doing that, you can fairly accurately predict what your actual TDEE is instead of just relying on a calorie calculator online. Those are just ballparks. Now, after that, if you feel like your metabolic rate has decreased much more than what it should have, you can start increasing your calorie intake while closely monitoring your body weight. Aside from an initial increase of a few pounds in body weight, usually due to water weight, what you're trying to do is find that sweet spot where you're consuming the maximum amount of calories while keeping your body weight relatively stable. So once you find your actual TDEE, try and slowly increase those calories while trying to keep your body stable. What you're essentially doing is slowly pushing your body to force it to adapt to a higher calorie intake, but without adding fat mass. Now, if you reach the point where your body weight starts to go up consistently, then you should dial it back down. Again, you're looking for that sweet spot of maximum energy intake, but stable body weight. Now, once you find that sweet spot, keep it up for a few weeks, maybe even slightly increase calories to try and force your body to adapt a little bit more, and that should, in theory, fix metabolic adaptation and maybe even cause your body to adapt to higher levels of calorie intake. Now, while this problem is sound in theory, the problem lies with the execution. See, the majority of people don't have the knowledge and experience necessary to accurately track their calories to the extent that is necessary for this strategy. Most people vastly underestimate the amount of calories that they consume. So I implore you, before jumping into any sort of rash conclusion that your metabolism is broken, try and reevaluate whether or not you're actually eating at the level that is necessary for you to lose weight. There's a very big chance that you're just underestimating the amount of calories that you're eating. Now, if you truly are suffering from a high degree of metabolic adaptation, but you don't have the confidence or skills necessary to accurately track your calories, then simply track your food intake in conjunction with your body weight. Instead of thinking about adding calories, just think about increasing your food intake a little bit at a time. Usually that will be through means like adding extra snacks until you reach that sweet spot that we were talking about. And of course, you always have the option to simply reduce calories even further to compensate for metabolic adaptation rather than trying to fix it. Ultimately, this decision is up to you. Use your own critical thinking to decide whether or not you should spend time fixing metabolic adaptation or whether you should just reduce the food that you're eating to compensate for it. Now let's recap everything in this video and then I'll leave you with some closing thoughts. Metabolic adaptation is a thing. It can affect your metabolic rate through spontaneous, sometimes unnoticeable physical activity, as well as directly on a cellular level. It will affect each person differently, ranging from unnoticeable to completely debilitating in rare instances. The more you restrict your calories and the longer you do it, the more severe metabolic adaptation seems to be. There is also a huge genetic component in metabolic adaptation. To prevent or minimize metabolic adaptation, you want to focus on losing weight slowly, increasing the deficit through exercise rather than calorie restriction, as well as implementing diet breaks and refeed periods. Now, to fix metabolic adaptation, you want to eat more food to force your body to adapt to a higher calorie intake, but not enough to actually put any significant weight. And you also need to do it for a prolonged period of time, usually for a period of a few weeks or maybe even months. Now, here are my closing thoughts on this matter. As a dietitian, I've worked with hundreds of clients. I'd say about 70% of them think that their metabolism is broken. 90% of those are way off track and they lose weight completely fine once they get into a well-structured and balanced diet regimen. Now, 5% of them do find it exceedingly difficult to lose weight, but that is usually due to some sort of medical condition that has been left untreated. And for the remaining 5% of them, yes, metabolic adaptation might be the one to blame for their struggles in weight loss. My point is that you shouldn't just immediately rush into the conclusion that your metabolism is broken just because you've hit a snag on your weight loss. There is a very high likelihood that you're just not tracking calories accurately, or that you're just too eager to lose weight. A lot of mainstream media and fitness guru BS has given people ridiculous notions about how fast a proper weight loss actually is. Some people seriously expect to be able to lose 5 pounds per week and actually think that there's something wrong with their metabolism if they don't hit those numbers. Whereas in reality, you're lucky if you lose like 1 to 2 pounds per week. And I'd say that even less is enough for some people. Now, if you truly are suffering from a high degree of metabolic adaptation, I do hope that this video has helped you realize what's going on. Or hell, at the very least, it's just some interesting random facts for your next Thanksgiving dinner. That was a video. If you liked it, I would really appreciate a like. Let me know your thoughts on this very complex and interesting issue down in the comments. If you want to see more no BS nutrition videos, then consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.